numerous 18th century authors, artists, and thinkers from Cagliostro to Mozart, and still underlies many contemporary beliefs about ancient Egypt. Without further ado, here is Dr. Geoga.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and I'm just gonna see if there's a way to advance the slides without leaning over so far. You can move the card. So that maybe sorry, I should have figured this out before we started. Here we go. That'll be perfect.
Let me get the lights.
Oh,
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me and for being here this evening and for coming to hear about one of my very favorite works of literature. There we go. This is okay. Yeah, so as Andrew mentioned, this talk will focus on my current book project, which investigates the transmission and reception of an unusual ancient Egyptian poem. The Teaching of Amenemhat is the only work of ancient Egyptian literature to depict the murder of a king. The poem takes us back to 1960 BCE, when King Amenemhat I has just been assassinated by his bodyguards. He's now speaking to his son from beyond the grave, describing the details of his violent and unthinkable murder, and advising his son about the dangers and loneliness of kingship. For 1,000 years, this dark and dramatic poem was one of the most popular works of ancient Egyptian literature. It was read all throughout Egypt by a wide variety of people, from bureaucrats in the capital to scribal students in the provinces to kings in Nubia. This talk will investigate what the Teaching of Amenemhat meant to its many ancient readers. And this big question can be approached via several smaller ones, such as who was reading the poem and in what contexts, and how did they interact with the text? What changes did they make to the poem as they read and copied it and passed it down? I will also investigate how interpretations of the Teaching of Amenemhat changed over time, over these approximately 1,000 years in which the poem was in circulation. And this will help us get at this lingering question of why this unusual poem with such an unusual and dark topic was so popular for so long. So I'll start tonight with a little bit of background on the poem and its surviving manuscripts and some of the previous scholarship about it. Next, I'll discuss the context in which most of the teaching's ancient readers encountered it, which is scribal education. So I'll discuss how this context influenced how scribal students read the Teaching of Amenemhat, as well as how scribal students were editing the poem over time. And I'll end this section with a consideration of how the poem eventually became a foundational component of scribal identity in ancient Egypt. In the next section, I will follow the teaching from Egypt to Nubia. I'll focus on one reader in particular, the Nubian king Taharqa, a member of the literature-loving 25th dynasty, and examine how he reinterpreted and repurposed the poem. And then I'll end with some conclusions about how the Teaching of Amenemhat traveled through all these times and places and contexts, as well as some broader takeaways for how we should think about this poem today. The Teaching of Amenemhat opens with the apparently dead King Amenemhat addressing his son, Senwosret. Amenemhat urges Senwosret not to trust anyone, because even the people to whom he had been generous betrayed him in the end. Amenemhat then describes his own assassination. He was relaxing in bed one evening, drifting off to sleep, when his own bodyguards attacked him, and he couldn't get to his weapons in time. He doesn't explicitly say so, but he strongly implies that he was not able to fight off his attackers and that the attack did not end well for him. Amenemhat then explains that the attack happened before he had officially appointed Senwosret as his successor, hinting at political difficulties to come. The final sections of the poem include descriptions of Amenemhat's many accomplishments as king. He says he provided for his subjects, he defended them by defeating and subjugating these various groups of foreigners. And then the teaching ends on a somewhat more optimistic note. Amenemhat assures Senwosret that he will now become a beloved king, before bidding him farewell with some final words of advice. The characters in the Teaching of Amenemhat are, of course, based on real kings who ruled in the early Middle Kingdom from about a period from about 2050 to 1650 BCE. And this period is regarded by scholars today and also by the ancient Egyptians themselves as a golden age. Long after their deaths, the real-life Amenemhat I and Senwosret I were remembered by later Egyptians as models of kingship. The poem is written in Middle Egyptian, which is the phase of the ancient Egyptian language that was spoken and written in this period in the Middle Kingdom, and that then remained in use in many written contexts for the next 2,000 years or so as a sort of classical or traditional language. The poem belongs to an ancient Egyptian genre called sabayit, or wisdom instruction. These poems are generally framed as a father speaking to his son, giving him advice on how to live a good and moral life. Some famous examples that you might also know include the Maxims of Ptahhotep, the Loyalist instruction, the instructions of Amenemhat. These texts instruct on topics such as providing for the less fortunate, being a good courtier, controlling one's emotions, even using good table manners at banquets. The Teaching of Amenemhat calls itself a sabayit, so it's explicitly placing itself in this genre, but it's very different from other members of the genre for several reasons, including its royal focus, its dark and dramatic tone, and its description of a royal murder, which is something that's unheard of in the other wisdom instructions and really in all other ancient Egyptian literature, period. It also differs from other wisdom instructions in the fact that it doesn't actually contain a whole lot of advice. In fact, it departs from the conventions of the genre almost immediately, dipping its toes into other genres like lament, narrative, and funerary autobiography, before eventually returning to the instruction genre for the final few lines. So right off the bat, there is something slippery about this poem. Over the years, scholars have made many attempts to reconcile the poem with the historical record, which doesn't necessarily seem to tell the same story as the poem. At the heart of these attempts is the lingering question of what exactly happens in the poem. Was Amenemhat assassinated, or did he survive a failed assassination attempt? The text seems to offer no definitive statement on this crucial question, and Egyptologists remain divided. And as you'll see in a little while, I think ancient readers may also have been divided on this question. Another question that has preoccupied Egyptologists is why this poem was written. What was the author responding to? Why did he write it? And what was he trying to accomplish with it? The most influential work on these issues is by the Egyptologist George Posner, who proposed in 1956 that the Teaching of Amenemhat was composed as a work of propaganda during the reign of the real-life Senwosret I in order to legitimize his rule and his claim to the throne. Others have since built on this model and suggested that the poem is propaganda in support of the practice of co-regency, or a pretext to allow Senwosret to target his political enemies. However, this so-called propaganda model has been rightfully criticized in recent years, anachronistic and overly reductive, and for ignoring the complex artistry of ancient Egyptian literature, the push and pull between the text and its readers, and the multiplicity of interpretations that ancient readers could have had. Ultimately, we just don't know very much about the Teaching of Amenemhat's author or the circumstances of its composition. It's highly likely that, like other Middle Egyptian wisdom literature, it was probably written in a courtly context, but we don't know when it was written, who wrote it, or why. A later ancient tradition that we'll discuss shortly attributed the poem to a pseudo-author named Keti. And we'll see more about him later, but its true author and all details about its composition remain unknown. We know much more about the poem's circulation. The teaching survives today in an unusually large number of manuscripts. We have over 250 and counting. In fact, I just heard of a new one last week. That's more than almost any other ancient Egyptian literary text. And these manuscripts are written on a wide variety of media: papyri, writing boards, ostraca. The poem even appears in a few tomb graffiti. Nearly all of these manuscripts bear excerpts rather than the full poem, so we don't have 250 copies of every part of the poem. Copies of the teaching have been found all throughout Egypt, from Memphis north to Elephantine. In the south, there are even a few copies from Nubia. All but one of these manuscripts date to the New Kingdom, so about 1550 to 1069 BCE. Of those New Kingdom manuscripts, a small portion date to the 18th dynasty, or the first half of the New Kingdom. About 90% of them date to the Ramesside period, or the second half of the New Kingdom. And just for the sake of simplicity for this talk, I'm going to refer to those periods as the early and late New Kingdom and save myself some extra words. The only non-New Kingdom manuscript dates from the late period in the mid-first millennium BCE. So that gives us this period of circulation of about 1,000 years. So it's still being read at least 1,000 years after its earliest known copy. So with this wide geographical range and this very long period of circulation, it's clear that the teaching of Amenemhat had a great number of ancient readers, and that those readers encountered the poem in a wide variety of places, contexts, and periods. And those different circumstances would have impacted how those readers interpreted and experienced the poem. So let's consider some of those readers and reading contexts now and examine the role of the teaching of Amenemhat in scribal education and identity in the New Kingdom. The vast majority of these surviving manuscripts of the teaching of Amenemhat have been identified as exercises copied by scribal students. This isn't unique to the teaching of Amenemhat. This is true of all literary texts from ancient Egypt. And it doesn't mean that scribal students were the only people reading these texts. It just means that they're the audience best represented by the surviving manuscripts. Scribal education in ancient Egypt began with a few years of early education during which a student would learn the basics of reading and writing and math, and then would advance beyond the beginner level and move on to an apprenticeship with a master scribe. And in this phase of education, apprentices would start to tackle more complicated texts. Surviving descriptions of scribal training indicate that apprenticeships involved, in part, copying out literary texts chapter by chapter. And wisdom instructions, including the teaching of Amenemhat, were an especially popular genre for scribal training. These poems formed the core group of literary texts that were copied by apprentices all throughout Egypt. Now, scribal apprenticeships were not a formalized institution. The specifics of apprenticeships varied depending on factors like the profession of the instructor scribe, who could be working in the royal treasury, or as a draftsman decorating tombs, or as an accountant on a private estate. There were lots of different kinds of scribes, and therefore lots of different kinds of scribal apprenticeships. And as a result, apprentices copied their texts in a variety of locations, which would have impacted their experiences of those texts. So even within the same social context of scribal education, there's variation among readers' experiences. In the case of the teaching of Amenemhat, some apprentices read it in places dedicated to scribal training, like temple schools. But others encountered the poem in environments that today we might not associate with schooling. This manuscript pictured here, for example, is an apprentice's exercise that was copied in Thebes and the cemetery of Sheikh Abdel-Qurna, also known as the tombs of the nobles. This apprentice read the teaching during the construction of the tomb of the official Senenmut in about the 1480s BCE. So how might this setting have impacted this apprentice's experience of reading the teaching of Amenemhat? Let's think about this reader's journey to his workplace at Senenmut's tomb. So first, the apprentice would have had to leave the bustling city of Thebes. He would have walked through the fertile green fields that hug the Nile, and then into the dust of the desert, crossing this stark natural boundary between the land of the living and the land of the dead. Once in the cemetery, the apprentice would have had to climb to Senenmut's tomb, which is located up here at one of the highest points in the valley. So in order to get there, the apprentice would have had to climb past dozens of other tombs, some of them still under construction, some of them already hundreds of years old. And we can imagine that reading the teaching of Amenemhat while surrounded by the dead could have highlighted Amenemhat's mortality, a key theme of this poem, which explores, among other things, this tension between divine kingship and the king's humanity. Perhaps for this reader, the setting made Amenemhat's hints about the outcome of the attack feel especially sinister. But this apprentice wasn't only surrounded by the dead here. He was also surrounded by the hustle and bustle of construction, by people building these monuments intended to preserve the memory of the owners. And from his vantage point, he also would have been able to see living people coming to the cemetery to visit old tombs like tourist sites. An especially popular one of these was nearby, and it belonged to a lady named Senet. It was built around the time of the events described in the teaching of Amenemhat, about 500 years earlier. So even while the cemetery setting could have made the poem's funerary elements more prominent for this reader, it also could have invited him to reflect on the endurance of the past, even the endurance of the memory era of Amenemhat I in particular. Another apprentice copied an excerpt of the teaching of Amenemhat at the pyramid complex of Senwosret I, around 1200 BCE. At this time, the pyramids of both Senwosret I and Amenemhat I had already been largely dismantled. But at Senwosret's pyramid, some of the highly desirable casing stones and foundation stones were still in place. And this apprentice was probably at the pyramid as part of a team that was trying to quarry away some of those remaining stones. So why was this apprentice reading the teaching of Amenemhat at this site in this context? No other literary manuscript or scribal exercise has been found in the pyramid complex, suggesting that it wasn't a regular place for scribal instruction. So the apprentice was probably reading Amenemhat here because of its connection to the site, because he was at the pyramid of one of the poem's protagonists. So what was he thinking about when he was reading this poem here? Maybe he thought about how Amenemhat and Senwosret lived on through this poem, even as their pyramids crumbled right in front of him. A sentiment that we find in other ancient Egyptian poetry. Perhaps the poem even made him reflect on his own role in the pyramid's destruction, or perhaps the setting just had a more general effect, simply helping him to feel an immediate connection with this distant past. Ultimately, I can only speculate about how context and place and other external factors impacted apprentices' reading experiences. But I think this speculation is still valuable and generative because it makes us create space for this multiplicity of ancient experiences and leave behind any implicit assumption that all ancient readers understood the poem in the same way. Let's turn now to the content of the surviving manuscripts of the teaching. And no two of these manuscripts are exactly the same. They have slight differences in things like spelling, grammar, which lines are included and excluded, how the different stanzas are arranged. And because nearly all of them are scribal exercises, there's been a tendency to interpret these kinds of variations as either errors or evidence that readers simply didn't understand what they were reading. And that does often seem to be the case, but that doesn't have to be the end of the story. I would argue that errors and misunderstandings are still revealing about how ancient readers were interpreting this poem. So based on my analysis of all the textual variations within the corpus of New Kingdom manuscripts, I have identified two related interpretive shifts that were occurring over the course of the period. First, the political elements of the poem's plot grew less clear and less prominent over time, suggesting that scribes were less interested in this part of the text. And at the same time, other variations suggest that scribes were increasingly interested in their aesthetic and affective experiences of the poem. And I'll show three examples of textual variations to support this argument. The examples come from stanza 8, where the political background of Amenemhat's attack starts to grow muddy over time, at the same time that the attack starts to be described in more personal terms. And also in stanza 5, where what starts out as a call for political consequences for the attack later turns into an elegiac description of Amenemhat's valiance. So bear with me for a few minutes. I'm going to get into some nitpicky grammar, but even those of you who aren't exactly up on your hieroglyphs should still be able to follow along. Okay, so we are now in the 8th stanza of the poem. This is when Amenemhat is describing the political situation at the time of the attack. And these verses are key to many scholars' interpretations of the poem today. So here's an early version of this section. It's from papyrus Millingen from the 18th dynasty, dated to around 1400 BCE. So in this copy, the 8th stanza begins, "Look, the wound happened while I was without you. Before the court had heard, I would hand over to you." The early New Kingdom copies all use this somewhat uncommon verbal construction to say before the court had heard. It's called the sejum tef, and it communicates in this case very clearly that Amenemhat had intended to inform the court that Senwosret was his chosen heir, but that he was attacked before he was able to do so. In the second half of the New Kingdom, it seems that copyists of the Teaching of Amenemhat no longer recognized the sejum tef verb form due to ongoing processes of linguistic change. Remember that the poem is written in Middle Egyptian. In the New Kingdom, all of these readers speak Late Egyptian. So while this verb form appears in all of the early New Kingdom copies of this section, it doesn't appear in a single Late New Kingdom copy. And in many cases, the loss of this verb form led to revisions that are practically unintelligible, as in this example here, which shows confusion over first verb form of the sentence, which is actually a pretty common confusion throughout the whole poem. There's also some murkiness in the word court, and some confusion over who is doing the handing over to whom and when. So it seems that readers like this one simply didn't understand what was happening in this line anymore. This relationship between the wound and the court and hearing that was so precise in the early New Kingdom copies is now muddied in the Late New Kingdom. As a result, for a significant number of Late New Kingdom readers, the poem no longer made it exactly clear how the attack related to the royal succession. At the same time, copyists made another change to this stanza that seems to make it more emotionally affecting. So in the early New Kingdom copies, Amenemhat tells us, "Look, the wound happened while I was without you." But in the Late New Kingdom copies, that becomes, "My wound happened while I was without you." That "my" seems to emphasize the personal nature of the attack. It's not just an attack against a political institution, but also against a person. This is a small change, but it appears in nearly all of the Late New Kingdom manuscripts, and so I believe that we should interpret it as it's written and as part of this broader shift in readers' interests. The addition of this pronoun suggests that as the political context of the attack grew less clear, readers were paying more attention to its emotional impact and to their affective experience of reading the poem. A similar shift occurs in the 5th stanza. This is when Amenemhat is urging his descendants to mourn for him. So in the early New Kingdom version, Amenemhat tells his descendants, "Make for me grief that has not been heard, and a magnitude of fighting that has not been seen." This has been widely interpreted by scholars as Amenemhat calling on his supporters to avenge him. And that reading supports this idea that the poem was meant to be a work of propaganda to allow the real Senwosret I to target his political enemies. But in the late New Kingdom version, the relationship between the two lines changes. All of the late New Kingdom copies add this tiny word "eu" to the beginning of the second line. This word doesn't make sense here in Middle Egyptian. So previous scholars have generally dismissed it as an error and read the line as if it wasn't there. But it appears in every Ramesside copy of this section, and all of these scribes have made the same error for no reason. I argue that we should take this as a meaningful change. And we can do that if we remember that these copyists are not Middle Egyptian speakers, they're late Egyptian speakers. If we take this "eu" as a late Egyptianism, then suddenly it becomes meaningful. It makes the second line into a circumstantial clause. So that means that in this late New Kingdom version, Amenemhat now tells his descendants, "Make for me grief that has not been heard, for the magnitude of fighting had not been seen." So in this version, the second line isn't a call for vengeance, but rather it seems to be a description of the extreme violence of the attack. It's a magnitude of fighting that had never been seen before, and a justification for the intensity of the display of grief that Amenemhat is asking for. Grieve for him more intensely than you've ever grieved, because he went through something more terrible than anyone's ever gone through. So this small textual change seems to be a pretty clear window into this interpretive shift that's happening over the course of the New Kingdom, in which this line that was originally about political consequences loses that meaning and becomes instead this emotional and elegiac description of a dramatic event. And I want to clarify here that I'm not arguing that late New Kingdom readers were suddenly reading the teaching of Amenemhat in a radically different way, or that the political elements of the poem disappeared. These are pretty subtle changes, and they don't change the fact that the poem is describing a succession crisis in the wake of an assassination. So these are inextricably political problems and acts. What I'm proposing here is that ancient readers were getting more out of this poem than modern scholars have thus far been able to imagine, because we are so fixated on the poem's politics. For New Kingdom scribes, though, the poem was not just an account of a king's death and a prince's accession, but also a text with beauty and drama and emotional intensity. This flexibility of the poem led to flexibility of interpretations and the possibility of seeing things in it beyond royal intrigue, beyond its basic plot elements. And that allowed ancient readers to make it their own. For New Kingdom scribes, that meant seeing the teaching of Amenemhat as a scribal text, despite its royal subject matter. So even though at first glance this poem seems to be about how to be king, New Kingdom scribes saw themselves in the poem and used it to say something about themselves. The teaching of Amenemhat was being read by New Kingdom scribal apprentices alongside a number of other Middle Egyptian poems, as we discussed earlier. These poems formed not only the curriculum of scribal education, but also the foundation of scribes' self-fashioning. And I'm borrowing this concept from Stephen Greenblatt, who describes self-fashioning as this process of constructing and publicly presenting an identity in self-conscious and intentional ways. So for scribes, what made the teaching of Amenemhat into such a good tool for constructing and displaying their scribal identities was its reputation for high cultural value and exclusivity, a reputation that was built up in other texts talking about scribehood and the texts that make up their training. So the most direct evidence of this comes from another poem called The Immortality of Writers. It's one of the very few examples we have of the ancient Egyptians writing about how they thought about their literature. The poem is known from a papyrus from the village of Deir el-Medina, and it doesn't seem to have circulated among the general population. It seems to have been a composition that was really by and for scribes. The poem urges the reader to be a scribe and to emulate the great authors or great sages of the past. It says that no one today can surpass or even equal these sages. What sets them apart is not just that their writings are great, but also that their writings are old, that they have long outlived their authors, and yet they continue to be read and valued. And these great writings, as we'll see in just a moment, include the Teaching of Amenemhat. So the immortality of writers discusses the works of these great sages, again, in the context of scribal education. The offspring of others here refers to scribal apprentices who become the heirs of the great sages by reading their writings, specifically their teachings or their wisdom instructions, in the course of their training. And through that training, scribal apprentices gain access to the so-called magic that's contained in these teachings, which is hidden from the masses. So it's only trained scribes who can truly understand these texts, according to Scribes. An earlier stanza of the poem includes a list of the names of the great sages who wrote these teachings. All of these names belong to the authors or the narrators of Middle Egyptian wisdom poems. And you'll notice that Amenemhat I, the narrator of the Teaching of Amenemhat, does not appear in this list. But the person that New Kingdom scribes believed to be the author of the Teaching of Amenemhat does appear as Kedi, who's described here as the chief of the sages. The connection is explained a few pages later in the same papyrus, where we find an offering dedicated to Kedi. And here again, he's singled out as the best of the best. He is the one whose lines are choice. And the offering specifies that those choice lines are the book of the teaching of the dual kings Sehetep Ra, which is an alternate name for the Teaching of Amenemhat. So not only is the teaching described here as the work of Kedi, the best of the sages, but it's being singled out as Kedi's best work. And like the immortality of writers, this offering to Kedi emphasizes the link between education and great literature, specifically the Teaching of Amenemhat. It says, so let a man, as one who is educated, speak a blessing in front of the scribe Kedi. So it's not just anyone, but specifically someone who can take on their identity as an educated person who is able to praise Kedi. So just as in the immortality of writers, there is a sense here that these great literary works, and in particular the Teaching of Amenemhat, belong to scribes because of their education and because of the identity it allows them to embody. Some scribes used their manuscripts of the Teaching of Amenemhat to demonstrate publicly this persona as the kind of educated scribe who could praise Kedi, who could access the magic of these great literary works. For example, some scribes kept their manuscripts in their own libraries, while others repurposed them as grave goods in order to demonstrate literacy, their cultural education, their scribal competence. Other scribes showed off their scribal personas more publicly. For example, the author of a graffito in a Middle Kingdom tomb in the city of Asyut, which is pictured here. In the New Kingdom, scribes started coming to this tomb and writing excerpts of wisdom instructions on the walls. And around 1350 BCE, a scribe named Men came to the tomb, and he added a long excerpt of the Teaching of Amenemhat, and he signed it with his name and his parents' names and his title of scribe. And in doing so, Men used the Teaching of Amenemhat to demonstrate his identity as this particular kind of scribe in a place where other scribes would see it. And by displaying that identity in this tomb, this place that's intended to last for eternity and is already being visited over and over again, centuries after it was built, by putting it here, Men perpetuated his scribal identity long beyond the New Kingdom. So what about readers who weren't scribes, or at least readers who had some scribal training, but whose primary social identity and public persona was something other than scribe? In the next few minutes, I'd like to move away from New Kingdom scribes and take a look at one such reader. So let's move now from Egypt to Nubia, from manuscripts to monuments, and from scribes to kings. So a little background quickly. During the New Kingdom, Egypt had colonial control over parts of Nubia. And in this period, the teaching of Amenemhat was copied a few times at Egyptian administrative sites in Nubia. But after the withdrawal of the Egyptian administration at the end of the New Kingdom, it seems that the teaching of Amenemhat, and actually all Middle Egyptian poetry, stopped being read and copied in Nubia for about 300 years, or at least we have no evidence of it being read and copied in this period. We start to get evidence of new Nubian encounters with Middle Egyptian literature in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, when kings from Nubia conquered Egypt and ruled over both lands as the 25th dynasty. And two of these kings quoted from Middle Egyptian poems, including the teaching of Amenemhat, in their monuments. First, there is the king Pianki, who is the one who conquered Egypt, and his great triumphal stela from a temple in Nubia famously quotes from a bunch of Middle Egyptian works. And then a few decades later, King Taharko's new temple in the city of Kawa quotes from the teaching of Amenemhat again, this time on the temple walls. Taharko's quotations suggest that, in contrast with New Kingdom scribes, Taharko was primarily interested in the teaching of Amenemhat's political elements, and that this interest enabled him to interpret the poem in a new and innovative way. So Taharko's quotations of the teaching appear in the first court of the temple. The poem is quoted on these three walls. It may have been quoted on that fourth wall, but if it was, it's on a part that hasn't survived. So we'll just look at these three. See, I failed to copy the text for this slide. Let's see if I can remember it. So on these three walls, we have these quotations that appear alongside these scenes. We have two versions of this top scene, which is the bottom half of the smiting scene, or the top half of, we would have had the mace in his hand. And then on the third wall, we have Taharko as a sphinx trampling his enemies. So we have three scenes of royal victory, three scenes of the king dominating his foreign enemies. If these scenes look familiar to some of you, that's because they are very clearly modeled after similar scenes in 5th and 6th dynasty mortuary complexes from the Memphite area. Now, the texts that accompany these scenes might also look familiar to some of you. Each of the three is accompanied by this highly evocative and memorable phrase, Dief Yersen Shemet Chezemu, he makes them do the dog walk. Now, Taharko's statement about making these foreign lands do the dog walk is not a typical expression in either Nubian or Egyptian temples. In fact, it occurs in only one other place, in the teaching of Amenemhat. Taharko says in his temple that he makes rebel lands do the dog walk, and Amenemhat says in the 12th stanza of the poem that he has made the Levantines do the dog walk. And this image of the dog walk probably refers to dogs like cowering or crouching. It's an image of submission, maybe even of humiliation. It's an image of the king in control and the people doing the dog walk obeying. Now notice that Taharko has not adopted the stanza wholesale. He's made some adaptations. For example, he does not describe himself dominating Nubians and Magi, as Amenemhat does. Instead, he describes a more generalized domination over all the lands that rebel against his authority. This seems to be a subtle subversion of Egypt's former colonial control over Nubia. So while Amenemhat the Egyptian could previously dominate Nubian peoples, now Taharko the Nubian can dominate the whole world. These adaptations to the stanza are part of Taharko's broader process of taking older Egyptian source material and adapting it to a new context in his temple where it serves a new purpose. This combination of imported Egyptian and indigenous Nubian elements asserted Taharko's dynasty's hybrid identity and his relationship with both the Egyptian and Nubian pasts. And he does it not only with the texts, but also with the scenes, as we just saw, and also with freestanding monuments all throughout the temple forecourt. So this archaizing hybridity is a key component of the temple's decorative program. Now, Taharko's quotations of the Teaching of Amenemhat raise an important question. Why this poem? There are plenty of other Egyptian literary texts that describe a king dominating his enemies, maybe not quite so evocatively as making them do the dog walk, but he had a lot of options. So why did he choose the Teaching of Amenemhat, which describes a regicide, to put in his temple alongside these scenes of royal victory and celebration? In order to answer this question, we need to turn to some of the other texts in the temple. Because when Taharko incorporated the Teaching of Amenemhat into this new context, he also brought the poem into a new intertextual network, which includes not the other wisdom instructions that we've seen discussed in the Immortality of Writers, but now a new set of texts, temple inscriptions. So what do the other inscriptions in the Temple of Kawa suggest about Taharko's choice to quote from his poem about a murderous plot against a king? Well, there is one other text in the temple that also discusses plotting, and it suggests that contrary to what we might expect, the plot against Amenemhat was precisely what made the poem so attractive to Taharko. This text occurs on a stela that Taharko had erected directly in front of one of these quotations of the Teaching of Amenemhat. The stela tells the story of the foundation of Taharko's dynasty, which happened through a covenant between the god Amen and Taharko's ancestor Alara. And this story isn't based on any earlier Egyptian text or myth. It is unique to this dynasty. So in this text, Alara says to Amen, "You put a stop to him that plotted evil against me after you set me up as king." So the foundational myth of Taharko's dynasty included a king facing a plot against him. Perhaps the quotations of the Teaching of Amenemhat in the temple were a subtle way to identify Taharko with Amenemhat I, who faced plotters, and also with Alara, the founder of Taharko's dynasty. Now, this intertextual reading of Taharko's temple texts suggests that Taharko understood the Teaching of Amenemhat as describing not a successful assassination, but a failed plot that Amenemhat overcame, just as Alara did with Amen's help. Taharko's new interpretation of the poem allowed him to use it to establish a link between himself and the distant Egyptian past and the more recent Nubian past. Now, reading Taharko's quotations of the Teaching of Amenemhat in this way, contextually, intertextually, and from Taharko's perspective rather than that of an imagined Egyptian author, is important to do, not only because it paints a fuller picture of the different ways this poem is being interpreted by its ancient readers, but also because it pushes back against legacies of colonialism in scholarship about ancient Nubia. There's been a long-standing tendency to interpret Nubian adaptations of Egyptian cultural forms as poor imitations by people who just didn't know better. Fortunately, this tendency is on its way out. And this reading of Taharko's quotations pushes back against it by arguing instead that Taharko was consciously and intentionally reinterpreting and repurposing these older Egyptian cultural forms. Let's recap some of the main conclusions about how the Teaching of Amenemhat was being read across time and place before turning to some broader takeaways from this project. So the best attested audience of the Teaching of Amenemhat is New Kingdom scribal apprentices. And although scribal apprentices are often discussed as this monolithic category, a monolithic social context, a close examination of the manuscripts that they read shows that their encounters with the poem were not all the same. They experienced significant variation due to factors such as the contexts in which they read the poem and their own shifting interests, which seem to have been moving away from the poem's political intrigue, even though that's the part of the poem that modern scholars have been most interested in, and toward the poem's aesthetic and affective qualities. Scribal discourse, as well as scribes' usage of their manuscripts, suggests that the poem played an important role in scribal self-fashioning. New Kingdom scribes viewed the poem not just as a royal instruction or a story of regicide, but also as a text that somehow belonged to them, that only they could truly understand, and that they could use to say something about themselves. After the New Kingdom, the poem traveled from Egypt to Nubia, where the king Taharqa quoted it in his temple. This innovative repurposing of the poem brought it into a new intertextual network, which suggests that he was interpreting the poem in a new way, no longer describing a regicide, but now an unsuccessful assassination attempt. Taharqa's reinterpretation and repurposing of the poem allowed him to use it to say something about his dynasty's political and cultural identity, which combined both Egyptian and Nubian elements. And now a few broader takeaways for the field of Egyptology and for us as readers more generally. First, by foregrounding readers rather than the author, it's possible to make space for multiple and flexible and fluid interpretations of the teaching of Amenemhat and for individuality within its readership. This reader-oriented and contextual approach can lead to new insights, not just about this text, but about all ancient Egyptian literary texts. Studying the reception of neglected texts can restore important perspectives to literary history more broadly. And in this case, studying the reception of the teaching of Amenemhat can be a step toward privileging the perspectives of ancient Egyptians and Nubians over those of modern and mostly Western Egyptologists. And in the case of ancient Egypt and Nubia, considering ancient reception can also help to ground our studies of later receptions of Egyptian culture, especially Western receptions, Egyptomania, kind of a trendy topic at the moment, because it helps us frame modern Western receptions not as authoritative, but as simply the next set of ideas in this long chain of receptions, of interpretations that are all contingent upon their historical moment. And then finally, the teaching of Amenemhat and other works of ancient Egyptian literature have rich interpretive histories that stretch across millennia. And just as these texts were an integral part of ancient Egyptian literary canons, so should they be an integral part of contemporary world literature canons. The wide range of roles that this poem has played for readers over the years illustrates all the things that it can be for us today. A story of intrigue, a dramatic and emotional lament, tedious homework assignment, a work that inspires and feeds nostalgia for a bygone golden age and a tool for negotiating one's particular identity. This poem's openness and malleability and its invitation to learn new ways of reading it, this, to me, is the magic of the text described in the Immortality of Writers. And that magic is just as valuable to contemporary readers today as it was to ancient Egyptians. Thank you very much for your attention. Very bright all of a sudden.
Yeah. All right. So any questions?
Do you think that the later readers felt like this was fiction that they were copying over and over, or do you think they felt it was history?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to give you a non-answer,
Okay.
which is that I'm not sure that we can actually assume that they divided it that way. So like if they're saying that it's by Kedi, even though the text itself claims to be the spoken words of Amenemhat first, there's some acknowledgement of like some kind of fictionality, that feels like not the right word for the distance I'm trying to describe there.
The fourth wall.
Yeah, sure, that's better. So there's a fourth wall that's broken there. They understand that the text isn't exactly what it claims to be. There does seem to have been a popular tradition that Amenemhat I was murdered by his eunuchs, according to Manetho, much later. It's unclear what they were thinking about this in the New Kingdom, and I feel like that could help us answer this question a little better if we knew what their understanding of the history was and whether it aligned with their understanding of the poem. But then again, it's not clear exactly what they think is happening in the poem either. So my answer is I don't know. It's a very good question, and I wish I could answer it.
Have people looked at the harem conspiracy then alongside it? You've got two different plots against royal kings. Are there any phrases that occur in those later contexts that show they knew about that when they were writing this down?
So I've taken a very cursory look at this so far. I do intend to look in a little more depth at like I'm assuming you're talking about Ramses III judicial papyrus. Yeah. I'm sure that the scribes who were writing that papyrus knew this poem. Whether it means that they're seeing the poem differently because of what they're watching happen in front of them to Ramses III, or whether they see the poem and think, oh, well, maybe this is a good way for us to deal with this problem that the king is actually dead, but he needs speaking. I'm not sure in which direction this like influence is moving, or maybe both, but I'm sure that there is some cross-pollination happening.
So I'm curious what you think, how you think the narrative of the strife that Amenemhat faces, how in that story, which is, as you say, all the surviving copies come from the New Kingdom, and whether or not they, the Egyptians thought he was really assassinated or he survived the assassination, yada, yada, yada. But how does that relate to the other most famous literary tale, which goes almost all the way back to Amenemhat's reign, tale of Sinaway, where it specifically starts with Amenemhat has died while his son was away, and he has to immediately return to Egypt to deal with this. And of course, Sinaway panics because he anticipates that they'll all be killed. He doesn't say why, but the implication obviously being that he's concerned they're going to be blamed for his death. And so that's like an almost explicit link to this event that's significantly closer in time to Amenemhat and Senwosret's reigns. So how do those two literary tales, and again, Sinaway being, hugely popular as well, so writing many copies and also recopied in the New Kingdom. So how do those two versions of events stack up with one another?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and also a frustrating one for a few reasons, including the openness of Sinaway. So listening to you say that Sinaway is worried they're all going to be killed because he thinks they're going to be blamed for his death. That is not how I take it. Actually,
No, it's an assumption. It's an assumption.
I always took it as he assumes they're all going to be killed because there are rival claimants to the throne, and that there's just like a general political vacuum or power vacuum, is the phrase. But that's actually, I think, a good example of either how open to interpretation these texts were, or how much we're missing today from them, or both, I guess. We don't find them, the two texts, together as often as I would have expected, actually. There are only a couple of instances where they're definitely being read at the same site together, which is something that really surprised me when I started this project, because I thought I would have expected them to be associated together because they're about the same thing. But Amenemhat really seems to be associated more with the wisdom instructions. So maybe they aren't actually even seeing them as describing the same event. Alternatively, This is something Jean Minon has suggested. If we buy Andreas Stauder's new dating of the Teaching of Amenemhat, which is an open question, as I mentioned, we don't know when it was written. The theory for a long time was that it was written around the time of the events it describes, right after the death of the real life Amenemhat first, so like 1950 BCE. About 10 years ago, there was a new publication arguing that based on the linguistics of the text, it seems like it was actually written a few hundred years later, and is like already looking back on a golden age. So if we buy this new dating and we see Amenemhat, the Teaching of Amenemhat as much later than Sippe, Jean Minon has suggested that the Teaching of Amenemhat was actually composed in order to answer this riddle of why Sippe flees, because he doesn't really give a satisfactory or like a single answer to this question. This was a very long-winded answer, which doesn't really give anything definitive.
Oh, thanks for mentioning Andreas. I think we can take his arguments at face value, they're very strong.
I think so too. I think it's probably later. Whether it's written as a response to Sippe, I don't think we can ever really answer that question, but it is a really interesting suggestion and one that I think is possible. Thanks.
This is just a footnote, but in your discussion of Taharka's trampling scene at Kawa, where he's the Libyan wife and children are shown there. Because we were just looking at Narmer palette and Alan Schulman's interpretation of the Narmer palette, which is that this is the original version of the Libyan motif, which is a symbol of power of kingship. So you might just want to put a footnote to that there.
Thank you. That's really nice.
There's Umar Sahure and there's someone else in between there too. Very last. And Taharka also, is very interested in propaganda. I mean, when you think about the Memphite theology and then how he's presenting himself as someone who, is aware of tradition and theology.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this kind of gets at like thorny question for myself, which is, I say I'm not interested in the author Teaching of Amenemhat. I don't really care if you intended it to be royal propaganda. I really care what readers are doing with it, and I don't think that that's what they're doing. But that is what Taharka is doing, and so now should we see Taharka as the next author, who for some reason I do care about now? But I think it's a good example of why it is important to consider the context and the readers, because he is clearly doing something very different with the poem than what New Kingdom scribes are doing. And we can ask whether anybody visiting this temple would have even recognized this quotation. I think probably not. But clearly that's not really what's important to him. They made visitors to the temple probably aren't going to walk in and say like, oh, it's the Libyan family seat, it's Sahure's temple. Like it just looks old and authoritative, and the specifics are maybe for a smaller audience, but they still matter.
And nevertheless, too, I mean, that's a very long time for a tradition to persist.
Yeah.
For both the teachings of Amenemhat and this motif.
Yeah, especially if we project it all the way back to an armor pal, this is, about as old as he could go.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for attending. You guys know we have dinner with hope you guys can join us. Yeah, and then,